So my name is Enrico Zimuel. I work for Rogway, Zend. I'm a developer since 1996. I have the same shirts. It was not intentional, but so maybe just let's try. Yes, yeah. Okay, cool. I work for Rogway for the Zend products, so I'm in the core team of Agility, Expressive and Framework. I'm also an international speaker, TEDx, I did some academic research, blah, blah, blah. And I am the co-founder of PHP user group of Torino. Very nice city. I strongly suggest to visit it. Okay, cool. So in this presentation, I would like to show you how to build a web API in PHP, of course, using Expressive. That is a micro framework that we built since 3 years ago. Maybe we started this project, and using a middleware approach. This is the first presentation of my talk, and I will also show you how to run this web API using the Swoole extension, and I'm going to show you some example. That is a very cool extension that gives you the ability to execute asynchronous PHP. So if you are familiar with Node.js, it's more like Node.js. So PHP like Node.js. That's the idea. Okay, let's focus on Expressive. As I said, this is a framework that we built some years ago, and it supports PSR 7. So I don't know if you are familiar with the PSR standard, PHP Fig standard. This is a good initiative of community of PHP that try to build some standard around interfaces. That's the main focus. So in this way, you can basically reuse components from different libraries because everyone is using the same interface. So you can interop with different technology. So you can say, okay, I can build a project using this component of Zend framework, this other component of Laravel, and so on and so on. So it's a very good practice. And of course, we was one of the proposal of this standard PSR 7 supporting HTTP messages. We also support PSR 15, that is a recent standard for middleware, and I will show you some example. Expressive works using piping workflow. That means basically you can pipe execution of middleware as a chain. So it's very simple, the workflow. It's just top-down, basically. You will see an example where I have a configuration file that shows you the workflow of the application. So the middleware that needs to be executed in order, top-down. So very simple. So if you compare this architecture with the MVC, the usual model view controller, even with the events, is more complicated because you have to figure out the workflow of the application based on the events, on the controller. So this approach simplifies a lot the workflow. That means it simplify also the maintenance of project because it's more simple to understand what's going on and to fix eventually problems. The features of Expressive are basically 4. So we support a routing system, of course, a dependency injection. So everything is shared between classes using a service manager. So basically you put the classes, the model, the services that you need to use inside your application, inside this service manager. This is a container. And you basically inject the dependency to the specific class that are middleware. So everything is very, very simple from an architectural point of view. Of course, we support templating. So we have an adapter. So you can use Twig, you can use ZenView, you can use plates, whatever you want, if we are talking about web application, of course. And we provide also JSON response, ALJSON model. So we did a bunch of the default templating systems. So even for API development or web application, classic web application. And of course, last but not least, error handling. That is very, very important. So just to give you an example, in a web API, you can throw an exception that will be rendered as an error problem, a problem details error. That is a specific standard for Web API. So this is very convenient because you imagine you are in a model, you have some issue, you can just throw an exception that automatically will be generated as API problem. So 403, 404, whatever the HTTP status you want to use it. So it is a very, very nice architecture. So everything is provided by Expressive. The last release, the 3.06, we released basically 1 month ago. And it's quite stable, so we, of course, we're working very hard to push this technology, and a lot of people enjoy it because it's very simple to use. Just to give you an idea, this is an entire application written on Expressive. So as you can see, it's a couple of lines. Of course, it's just a toy example. It's just a web API. So here we are exposing a /API/ping, very simple RPC call, and we are returning a JSON response. That is basically an acknowledge, so just a timing. So very simple example. But this is a running application. So you can take this example and run using Expressive. So this is a full application. As you can see, we have the container, where is a configuration file, basically where you specify the services that you need in order to execute the application. Inside the services, there is an application itself that is a middleware. So everything is a middleware. If you are not familiar with this technology, middleware is basically a function that gives an HTTP request and produce a HTTP response. So it's like that. This anonymous function here is a middleware. So it's just a callable that gets the $request, that is the HTTP request coming from the web server, and returns a HTTP response. In this case, it's a JSON response. So very straightforward, very simple. So we are just piping. So the application, in this case, is just one middleware, so very simple. So the execution is just one step, that is this middleware. So if the HTTP request is /API/ping, I execute this function here. Very simple. And we have run here to execute basically the application. So that means you can inject as many middleware you want here, and execution is top-down. So the workflow is just as simple, just it. Of course, this is an example with anonymous function. You can have, normally, you don't want to use anonymous function to put everything in one giant PHP file, of course. So you can also, for instance, have a ping handler class, so a class that implements a specific interface of the PSR 15 standard that do exactly the same. So instead of writing your code here, you're just saying, okay, when /API/ping come, I execute this ping handler class. That's it. So this is the workflow of an Expressive application. Let's see how is this ping handler class, for instance. Again, we are using PSR standard. So as you can see here, we have a couple of namespace that are just PSR 7 for the HTTP messages, the first two. The third is the PSR 15. So we are implementing here a request handler interface. That is a very simple interface that you have to implement with just one function, that is the handle, that has a request, that is a server request interface. Again, this is a PSR 7 standard. So you have this object, basically, that represents the HTTP request. You can, I don't know, take the parameter from the URL, do whatever you want, and you have to return a response. That is a response interface. So this is the same example of the previous slide, but in a class fashion way. Again, these are standard. Request handler interface are not provided by us. It's provided by PHP Fig initiative. Okay, you can do even more, because one of the best, the key feature, the killer feature of the middleware approach is the ability to execute middleware inside another middleware, like Chinese box. So basically, this is again PSR 15 standard. This is a middleware interface. If you see here, we have just one function that is process that get an HTTP request and has also a second parameter. So if we compare the previous slide, here we have just the HTTP request, and we expect that this handler will return an HTTP response, right? In this other example, we can also say, okay, I'm passing the HTTP request and an handler. So that this is an object that implements a request handler interface. That means that I can decide inside the middleware if I want to execute this handler inside my middleware. So it's like to say, okay, this middleware will introspect another middleware. So I need to execute another middleware to get the response going back. So you can have a model like, an onion model. If you're familiar with the kernel of Linux, it's basically an onion model. So you have, the kernel inside. You have a couple of services. It's the same idea here. So you can have a services that consume another one. So you can have like, Chinese box and execute, this. And you can iterate around this execution. This is very, very powerful because, for instance, this is an example. Let me scroll down a little bit. This is an example of authentication. So this is a real example that I just copy and paste from a Zend Expressive Authentication repository. So this is a component that you can reuse to authenticate HTTP requests. So of course, you will need some adapter like, HTTP basic authentication, digest authentication, OAuth2. But the general idea is exactly this. I get an authentication services. So $this out is an authentication services. So someone that is able to authenticate an HTTP request. So it says basically, okay, I authenticate the HTTP request, is valid or not. And if it's valid, it returns some information, like, for instance, the user. If you think about the OAuth2, this will be the token associated with the user, for instance. So in this case, basically, we are just saying, OK, the HTTP request is authenticated or not. If its $user is different from null, that means that we have some results. So the user is authenticated. And we can execute the handle. As you can see, the handler here, the $handler, we call the handle function. That is the same function of the previous interface, request handler interface. So basically, here we are saying, okay, if we have some authenticated user, we can pass on to the next middleware. So that means, okay, the user is authenticated, so I can execute the second, the third, and so on. If it's not, I can just return an unauthorized response. For instance, 403, whatever you want to implement here. So these few lines of code are actually the real implementation of any authentication system of an HTTP middleware application. So it's very, very powerful. If you are not familiar with this technology, you can say, it's too simple. I don't trust you because it's like magic, But if you spend some minutes to think about this approach, you will discover that the MVC is basically garbage compared with it, because we spend a lot of years saying MVC is the architecture that we need to use because in computer science everyone is using MVC. Every basically languages, framework use this approach. But if you think about a web application, the nature of a web application is just a black box that gets an HTTP request, that by the way is a string, and produce an HTTP response that by the way is another string. So if you think about that, this approach is very strict to the web application needs. Any question on this part? Because it's the main topics of my presentation. Okay. By the way, who is using already this kind of technology? Middleware, Laravel, whatever. Okay, so you already know about it. Why don't me? Okay, we know this. You can skip this slide. Okay. Okay, this is just, of course, a brief introduction. I would like to show you some of the features of Expressive, like, for instance, the routing system. So here there is an example of a routing definition. You can think this as a REST, API. So we have /API/users with an optional parameter that is ID, the ID of the user. So we use this syntax. As you can see here, we say, okay, $up, if you remember the first example, is the instance of the application itself. So you can we are just configuring here some routing. There is the root method that we use it. This is the URL. The second parameter is an array of middleware or user action that are actually request handler that you need to execute in order. So basically that means, okay, if someone send, for instance, a get on /API/users, I will execute the first middleware, that is authentication middleware. So this gives me the authentication. So if you are not authenticated, I will skip the execution of the other two, because as I show you in a previous slide, I just return an authorized response. If you are authorized, if you are authenticated, then you need to be authorized, because as you know, first authenticate and after authorize users. Okay, you are a user of my application, but who are you? An admin, a normal user, whatever. So we call another middleware, authorization middleware, and if you think about the implementation, it should be very similar to the authorization. There is some checking inside, I don't know, some databases, some ACL, airbag system that just give you the permission, basically, to continue the execution. The last, actually, middleware is the user action itself. So here you have the logic to provide the API. So this is, I think, a very nice example of how to implement for a specific route a specific pipeline like this. So you can have very, very sophisticated workflow, simple to read, but very, very general. Of course, you can also think, okay, I don't want to implement in just one class all the possible get, post, patch, delete methods. Imagine you have a very sophisticated model workflow that you need to implement. You can specify, okay, for the get of this URL, I execute one class. For the post, another. So you are, you can do whatever you want, basically. It's very, simple and convenient way to define a routing system. I'll start using Expressive, one line, using, of course, Composer. You can just use create project. The project, we provide a skeleton. So basically, it's Zen framework /Zen Expressive Skeleton. Because I didn't mention, but Expressive is a Zen framework initiative. So it's under the umbrella of Zen framework. You just specify the dir, the directory that you want to use to install the skeleton, and it just will give you some, ask you some question about, okay, you want to inject some dependency, which template you want to use. There are some questions inside the Composer execution, and at the end you will have an expressive skeleton application running. Okay, we provided a lot of libraries for specific needs. Regarding the API, if you want to render all JSON format, so all JSON is basically a format that supports hypermedia. So that means you can have links inside the result itself. So it's a JSON. It's very convenient. A lot of API use it. So you can just consume this Zen Expressive all. And by the way, in the slides they will publish online, when you see the blue text, this is an hyperlink, so you can just click and get to the specific project in this case. For the problem details, so we provide a Zen problem details. This is another standard for HTTP API to provide HTTP response error handling. So it's basically a JSON with some specific key that give you information about the specific error. And this is very nice because, as I mentioned earlier, we throw exception. So you can just throw an exception, so you can implement specific exception for your needs, for your model, whatever. And this will be rendered as then problem details. So it's a very, very nice way to manage error. Of course, we provide also filtering and validation. So when you have something like, for instance, post, patch, or put, you send some information to your API, we provide a class that is then input filter that provides filtering and validation itself. Very simple to use. We also provide authentication. We provide, basically, we support HTTP basic and OAuth2. We didn't support digest because we think that it's not so convenient. It introduces, the implementation of the HTTP digest is not so useful for in these days because it introduces some, elaboration that you have to do in the client that are not so useful from a security point of view. So if you care about security, you should use always HTTPS, of course, as a standard, minimum standard. And now this is a common requirement. And you can choose HTTP basic or OAuth2 if you have specific needs. So if you have, for instance, a lot of user, a lot of scope, a lot of permission, different permission, I strongly suggest to go to OAuth2. But if you have just a server-to-server machine with an internal API, whatever, just one or two users, maybe it's more convenient to go to HTTP basic. So this is very specific to the user needs. So you don't need OAuth2 always, because I see a lot of people say, no, I always use OAuth2. Okay, but in your case, maybe it's more convenient to have a less, infrastructure. And we also provide authorization. So we implemented ACL and RBAC. There are two systems for, authorization. Okay. If you are interested, I have this example, completely RESTful application written in Expressive. This is the repository. You can check it out if you are interested. Okay, let's jump to the other topics. As I promised, is Swoole. So what is Swoole? Swoole is an asynchronous programming framework for PHP 7. So it's very, strict definition. And actually, it's an extension. So it's written in C. So you have to install using, for instance, in our Unix box using PECL. Just wrote PECL install Swoole. And it's released under the Apache license. Of course, it runs only on PHP 7. But I suppose everyone is using PHP 7, right? Almost. Okay. This is the official website of the project. So just to give you some list of the feature of Swoole. So it's an event-driven asynchronous programming for PHP. So they give you the ability to run asynchronous programming and or event-driven. So it's a very, very nice feature. It provides you a lot of protocol, TCP, UDP, HTTP, WebSocket, HTTP2. So it's out of the box it supports HTTP2, client and server side. So it's very, very powerful. Of course, it provides v4, v6, and also SSL, TLS support. So that means you can really use this in production. It's very high performance. And this is the link of the official benchmark, so I don't want to. This is, of course, benchmark provided by Swoole, so you have to check by yourself. It's scalable, and it supports C1000 key. That means, theoretically, it's possible to have one server to manage 1 million of requests using this technology. Again, one server, 1 million of HTTP requests. Again, one server, 1 million of HTTP requests. So it's very amazing. And it also gives you a fast serialized and unserialized, because everything is C. So it's an extension that runs basically in parallel with the language itself. So it's very, 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 very powerful. You can also use to schedule using milliseconds. So it's a scheduler based on milliseconds. So again, very hardcore technology. This is an example. So imagine that you want to use, okay, let's try this Swoole extension. I want to just execute a simple HTTP server. This is the code that you have to write. So as you can see, it provides some Swoole underscore whatever function. This is the HTTP server, so you need to specify the IP address and the port. There is an event system, so basically that means when the HTTP start, let's execute this function that is just a log. I'm just writing started at HTTP whatever. Here on the request you have the logic. So basically that means when an HTTP request comes, you have this is an anonymous function with the request and response, and you can just say, okay, the response is content type text plain, and the body of the response is hello world. So very, very simple. And you start your application. So that means if you write PHP and the name of this script, this will execute a real HTTP server managing the HTTP request. So it's exactly the same of Node.js. So you don't need any more Apache, nginx. You don't need any more a web server. So it's a huge difference between the old approach of PHP, where you have, web server that communicate with the engine, PHP, etc. Why is so powerful? Of course, it's simple to write, but the real benefit comes because, of course, it's multi-threading. So when you execute this, this will basically execute different process of PHP if the needs, if you have more, HTTP requests. So it's auto-scaling, basically, based on the number of CPU that you have, the CPU core that you have, depending on the environment. By default, I guess it uses 4 process, because normally 4 is 4 core of the server. You can increase it even on runtime. So there is some configuration of the HTTP that you can say, okay, if this is very brilliant, because you can create an application that based on the CPU that you are using, that give you the number of cores, I can change the configuration of this wall at runtime. So it is very, very powerful stuff. And again, it's powerful because in this approach, basically you can say, okay, if I have, imagine that we want to execute an expressive application. As I mentioned, expressive, everything is used by a container. So you have this dependency injection container. So everything is put inside this repository, basically. And the specific middleware get the needs, the dependency. This is the bootstrap of your application, right? So when you execute an PHP application, basically in every framework, Symfony, Zen framework, Laravel, you have this phase, the bootstrap. Imagine to share these services with all the HTTP requests. So this is one execution, one time. The first time they execute the script, they will generate this service container in memory. So you can reuse this memory, because when a Swoole comes here in the request, it basically generates a new PHP process with the same shared memory that you pass here. Basically, you can reuse the memory, the service container, in all your HTTP requests. So that's why it's so powerful, because basically you are reducing the execution of your PHP application drastically. In fact, if you want to use Expressive with Swoole, there is a library, very simple to install. You have just to require this library. This is one of our contributors of Zen framework. So now it's experimental, so it's under the dev master, but we will release something stable very, very soon. The usage is straightforward. So basically, you have just to require this in your composer, and after you can just run the application using this command line tool that is Swoole Expressive, the host, the IP address, and the port. Very, very simple. Okay, this is an example how to actually is possible to use an expressive application using Swoole. As you can see, it's the same idea of the previous slide. So we are using Swoole HTTP server. We're just saying, okay, when an HTTP request comes, because the dollar request and dollar response are specific classes of the Swoole project. Unfortunately, right now there are not PSR7 standard, but we are working on it. So maybe we'll try to have a PSR7 ready HTTP request inside the extension itself. So we are basically trying to write in C the PSR7 interface. We need to do this conversion right now. So you have to pass some dependency. Of course, the $app, that is the dollar application of the Expressive. So basically the class that contains the application. And to utility to convert from PSR7 to Swoole and vice versa. So it's just to function to convert the HTTP request of Swoole in PSR7 and vice versa. And now, as you can see here, we are just saying, okay, I just execute the handle of application. I just execute the first middleware of my application. That's it. I get the response, and I return the response. I generate the response here from PSR7. That's it. So it's the same example that I showed you earlier for Expressive. So nothing complicated. Okay, let's try to do some benchmark. So this is a benchmark that I did using a skeleton application of Expressive. So it's just a simple web application with just one pages, so nothing so exciting here. But just to give you some flavor. On the x-axis, you have the concurrent request. So I start from 2, 4, 8, 16, until 128. And here we have the request per second. So the blue, as you can imagine, is Swoole. And we have also the purple, the green, that are basically Apache and nginx on two specific versions of Expressive 2 or Expressive 3. But the goal of this diagram is this gap. So as you can see, there is a huge difference between the number of requests per second using Swoole and the number of requests per second using Apache on nginx. Basically, the results are this. Expressive with Swoole runs 4 times faster than nginx and Apache. Again, Expressive with Swoole runs 4 times faster. So it's very, very surprising and exciting technology. I strongly suggest to have a look at it. Of course, it's production ready. That means the Peggle extension is ready, but you need to be careful. There is, of course, cons here. The cons is that you cannot expect to run a WordPress application or whatever you want, Drupal or whatever, using this approach, because if you get how Expressive works, it basically shares the memory. That means you cannot use $_session. You cannot use database connection, because if someone is closing the database connection somewhere, the other process will have a closing database connection. If you change a $session in one process, the other will have a different value. So that means you have to be careful how to use this technology, because you are in a shared memory environment.
You must rewrite the application.
Never rewrite the application. This is my gold rule. Never write some code that runs properly. My suggestion is, in the web API, I think this technology is a killing feature, because if you think about services, microservices, we have small things to do that needs to be run very fast. You don't want to have a heavy environment like a web server or whatever, just a way to run, execute your services by command line or by simple script. This is a very killing feature, because it's very powerful, very performant, very even elegant to maintain. It's very simple to maintain stuff like that, because you have 100 of lines of code. That's it. So you have not to be crazy to check about web server or whatever. Okay, so basically I conclude my presentation. This is the join D. So please rank this presentation. Sorry again for the issue about the slide, but you know, live speaking is funny, and I hope you enjoy this time. Thank you.